Welcome back, everybody. Now it's time for another panel. The last panel we heard about design thinking, and what was mentioned was sometimes it can be very difficult to implement new design thinking in supply chain within a company. There was an article in The Economist on the 24th of March which discussed the company Inditex, amazing Spanish company that owns a Zara fashion chain. They've got 6,000 stores and an ultra-short supply chain. And it quoted an executive, unnamed executive from Gap, who said, "I would love to organise our business like Inditex, but I would have to knock the company down and rebuild it from scratch." Obviously, you can't do that every day. So this panel is about how you do transform the supply chain within an existing enterprise, transforming the enterprise as you do so, of course. As before, the panel will introduce themselves. The bios of each are in your conference pack. And the chairman's Roddy Martin, Senior Vice President for Global Supply Chain at Competitive Capabilities International, Inc. Roddy.
Thank you very much, and especially to John for inviting me to the conference. Just a little bit of background on myself. I led supply chain for AMR Research, now part of Gartner, for about 12 years. And a lot of that work that we did at AMR was really about supply chain and what the leaders were doing. So the question that we're going to answer as a panel, and I'll tell you how we're going to do this, a little differently to the last panel. The way we're going to do this is I'm going to position some slides to plant some thoughts with the audience. And what I'm going to ask the panel members to do is to give their names, their roles, and then plant a key thought with you to start the panel off. In other words, every one of them, and I would like to say that it is actually quite daunting to manage a panel with this sort of experience, and it will become very evident as the panel goes on what kind of people and what kind of experience is behind what we're going to hear today. Then I'm going to ask them a series of questions, and we've got different industries here. We've got Procter & Gamble, we've got Dell, we've got Diageo, we've got change management specialists, and we've got academics. So it's a really well-balanced panel. So let me kick off first with some positioning slides. The first point is the question that we're trying to answer is, how do we transform a traditional supply chain into a set of processes that start at the point of demand and move horizontally back through the business as a end-to-end business operating strategy? That's the question. How do we do this? What have the leaders done? What have they learned? And what can we give you as really pragmatic takeaways in terms of supply chain transformation? So the very first starting point is the fact that those of you who know AMR's research will have seen the three circles AMR traditionally used in defining the traditional silos of any supply chain. There's a demand function, which is obviously sales and marketing. There's a product function, which is obviously product and a portion of innovation. And then there's the supply function, which is manufacturing, product supply, and all the traditional pieces of the supply chain. Now, when we were at AMR and we researched all of this, we said, well, it's kind of easy. You just pull these three circles together. And when you get out into the real world, you realize that's actually not so easy, because there's people, process, and technology, and there's some organizations like we're going to hear from Procter & Gamble, for example, that have codified this integration of people, process, and technology. And there are a number of other companies that have also done this, but we have P&G on the panel. So that's point number one, is this is what this is all about. It's a it's a pretty slide, but it is not a trivial matter to execute the business in that sense. So when I was working with P&G many years back, P&G are a very good example of a company that has literally systematized the supply chain, the end-to-end supply chain, starting with the point of supply, point of demand, the shelf. Jake and I, funnily enough, on the panel, sat in the cafeteria at Procter & Gamble and designed this picture. And there's some interesting aspects to this picture. The three main components. The green piece is sensing demand. It's the demand side of the supply chain, which traditionally is not really seen as part of a classic logistics supply chain. The red piece in the center is demand translation. In other words, when we sense demand, when we want to shape demand, where is the engine that translates that into some sort of a business plan? And then there's the blue piece, which is reliable and predictable product supply. Now, there's no need to tell you that companies have traditionally worked inside out or right to left. We made stuff, we planned it into the marketplace, we gave it to salespeople or services, whatever the case may be, but it went out to the consumer. When you hear Procter & Gamble and Dell and Diageo talking about their supply chain strategies and their transformation initiatives, what you're going to hear is it actually works the other way around. It's about the ability to sense demand. It's about the ability to take that demand sensed and translate it into a supply system. And that is a fundamentally different way of thinking about the supply system. Now, what we're going to spend a lot of time talking on is how exactly do you do this? Because it's not a question of just a whole bunch of projects or defining a set of strategic initiatives. This is a really complex organizational transformation. So let's move to the next piece. And this was probably the biggest realization or the biggest aha for me as I left the analyst world to go into the world of actually building end-to-end supply chains. This is a maturity model, and I'm going to keep on coming back to this maturity model over the course of our presentation. This is a 5-stage maturity model. The context of the maturity model is everything we do in the business is based on a maturity of how we solve problems and how we improve performance. So let's go to stage 1 down the bottom end. Stage 1, of course, we're reacting to problems. And there's many supply chains, many organizations I deal with, where the supply chain is a group of people simply scrambling around reacting to crises in the business. Then what happens is companies progress to stage 2. What happens in stage 2 is they build projects to solve problems around specialists. It could be a demand forecast project. It could be an inventory optimization. It could be a lean project. But the point is, it's a project mentality-based approach to building an end-to-end supply chain. Stage 3, once you progress through stage 2, is the business is operating as a set of integrated functions, but not necessarily end-to-end processes. So one of the best, or two of the best examples that I can give you is quality. So in stage 2, you may have product quality, you may have manufacturing quality, you may have supply quality, you may have shelf quality in a retail-driven business. But in stage 3, you're thinking about integrated quality and compliance as a holistic capability functionally in the business. Now what happens is there's a huge cultural jump from stage 3 to stage 4. Because in stage 4, you actually start to operate as an end-to-end set of processes, starting with the buyer and user of the product. That's the big jump. It's from stage 3 functional integration to stage 4 operating as an end-to-end system. So I said there were 2 examples. The other one is sales and operations planning. So in stage 2, demand forecast is one aspect of S&OP, and the supply system is the other element of S&OP. Stage 3, it's an integration of supply and demand to balance supply and demand. But stage 4, it actually becomes the integrated business plan. You see the progression of capabilities as you go from 2 to 3 to 4. And then stage 5 is operating as a value network that is learning. In other words, an Apple, somebody asked the question this morning, anybody here from Apple? The one most fundamental, interesting thing about Apple is they don't put products into supply chains, they build supply chains around products. That is a value system. They understand what the value to the consumer is, they've shaped demand, and they build the supply chain back down through the system. So very, very different approach. Now, the context of this picture is the fact that I've done benchmarking with 40 companies, and in fact, a few of the companies that participate in the benchmark are on here. Now, the industry average on 40 companies, I'm talking about really big companies, the Mars, the Dells, the Procter & Gambles, the Unilevers. The industry average is 2.4, which is about right when you think about the way most of us are approaching supply chain performance improvements. A set of projects. P&G is a 4.7. And Dell is in the low 3s, or was in the low 3s when we did the study. Unilever's in the low 4s. So there's something very different here when you look at the panelists in comparison to where the industry. And we're going to explore this because it has multiple dimensions of challenges that we have to deal with from people, process, and technology. So the key takeaway here is that the progression to operate as a value translation-based demand network is a journey. And it's a journey where you have to recognize the stages. And we spoke a little bit about this yesterday in the 3PL session. What is the problem? What is the challenge we have with IT? Well, what we do is we buy an IT system, we bring in consultants, they configure it for stage 5, and what do? We drop it onto a stage 2 organization. What do you think happens? They customize it, and then we get stuck. And what do you think happens? We're re-implementing, because as the business is progressing in its process capabilities, every time they reach a new fundamental requirement for processes, they have to re-implement the systems. Just look at how many companies are re-implementing big ERP systems today. So this language of the stages of maturity is fundamental to change management, to goals, to where organizations are, to what the priorities are, to how strategy gets translated. So this is a very, very important cornerstone of the presentation. Now, when a company is going down this journey through these 5 stages, and it started to come out in the last panel, companies that really build sustainable capabilities. I'm not talking about flash-in-the-pan brilliance. I'm talking about sustainable, agile capabilities. As they progress down the journey, go and look for 2 fundamental characteristics. What they're doing is they're driving standard work practices or best work practices, but they're always mapping that to results in the business. Because we can absolutely do all the work practices in the world, but if we're not making any contribution to business value, somebody's going to ask, well, why exactly are we doing this? On the other hand, we could have business results that are fantastic based on ad hoc processes, and when the rules change, the wheels come off, and we've got to start all over again. So companies that you see on this panel, what are they doing? They're balancing work practices and codifying the way that the business really operates. They're continually checking to see that this is actually driving results in the business. This is a very, very fundamental point. And it's only when you understand this relationship between codifying best practices in the organization, and I know there was the comment about best practices before, I'm talking about within a company. I have 13 breweries. Best practices in 13 breweries are, this is the way we run a filler, or this is the way we run a particular machine. And what they're doing is they're continually looking for those best practices, learning from those best practices, but making sure that they correlate to improve business results. So what happens is, we say, well, supply chain's end-to-end. Accept that. We've got levels of maturity. Accept that we're on a journey. So let's bring a consultant. Let's develop a business operating strategy. Great. We've got a vision. We want to double our volume, halve our sustainability impact, our strategic intent. We're going to be customer-focused. We've got some pillars in the strategy framework. We're going to cluster a whole lot of projects in there, and we prioritize the work. Now comes the real challenge, because this is just the fun part. This doesn't deliver good to the organization. When we look at supply chain has traditionally been seen as one of these columns. Now I'm now going to introduce a term that is fundamental to executing an end-to-end business operating strategy or a supply chain strategy, and that is integratively building the capabilities of the business. Integratively is a very, very significant term. This is not integrated, it's not optimized, it's all of the above. Integrative is a healthcare concept. We have to approach healthcare in an integrative way because there isn't one size that fits all. And so when we're executing this strategic vision, and you're going to hear this from Pat around how do you think about goals in this way. You're going to hear it from P&G and Dell and Diageo and Dr. Dag in terms of how are we developing leaders and how is academia developing so that we can actually put this brand new dimension into supply chain execution. One of the points Jake will make is the business operating strategy is the supply chain strategy. There's no 2 different things. Anyway, so as we get to the point where I'm going to start the panelists, ask the panelists to introduce themselves, I want to leave you with this one key thought, and this is also going to come out from our discussion. Leaders today have two roles. One is they have to drive performance today, right? I mean, we're a business, public business. We're expected to deliver results for the business today. Costs, growth goals, revenue targets, new product launches. But what leaders are increasingly being asked to do is to futurize the business, to think about those aspects of practices that will lead to brand new capabilities in the organization. And guess what? That has to be operationalized. So while we're doing today's work and thinking about tomorrow's capabilities, it means nothing unless we operationalize that. And that's where the real challenge lies. And the amusing story that I tell when I worked with Pat, and I'll give some context about that many years back at South African breweries, people would say, do you want me to do my job, left-hand side, or do you want me to do this other stuff on the right-hand side? No, you have to do both. You have to do your job in this new way. That's a real challenge for people. Okay, so without any further ado, I'm going to ask each of the panel members to introduce themselves. What they're then going to do is tell you a little bit about each of themselves, and then they're going to leave you, start with one key thought. And that key thought we will explore, and we will explore it as part of questions. And then at the end of the panel, after we've had some audience participation, so I want, as you hear things that we're talking about and you have a question, put your hand up, and I'll track to see whether there's a logical break in the process. And just before the end, I'm going to ask each of the panel members to revisit that point. Because my feeling is that when they walk out and we're all networking tonight, I want you to associate that point they made with that person, because it makes networking really valuable. Okay, so let's start the process. And I have to say a little bit about Pat, because Pat worked with me. Pat, in fact, started the transformation of South African breweries with Graham Mackay way back in the early 90s. And those of you who understand the history of South Africa know that there was not just a challenge of transforming a brewing company. But what SAB Miller is today was created between Pat and Graham Mackay, building a very different approach to change management and governance in an organization. And I'm actually very proud for the fact that Pat's on this panel, because she taught me everything I know about change management. Okay, enough about Pat. Let's ask Pat to introduce herself.
Oh, this is rough. First of all, thank you so much, John, for inviting me to this conference. I'm really excited to be here. I'm obviously not a supply chain person by trade, but maybe none of you really started out that way either. I consider myself kind of a storm chaser, but my storm that I'm chasing is transformation. And I started 40 years ago doing work with 3M Company, trying to help them develop their very first leadership development program. Back then, there was very little leadership development going on in companies. And I got brought into GE to help them develop all of their leadership programs and all of their manufacturing engineering, any program that they had that had anything to do with change. I was brought in to help with, because they realized that change was not something they could do functionally, that they had to do it by engaging the people in very different ways. And then obviously, ended up doing work in South Africa as well, and across a number of other places. But the question I'm always asking myself is, where is the log in the log jam if we are trying to transform organizations? And we are riding the crest of a very major shift that I think has been going on for 300 years. It's the shift from a rational approach to the world to an organic approach to the world. And I think we are lucky enough to be sitting here today at the very end, at the time of cusp, where the crossover point is happening in science, in philosophy, in organization design. And I think we here, and this is why I'm sort of chasing the supply chain and value network world, is I believe that you people are the force that's going to drive massive institutional change that is going to affect how our organizations work and how people see themselves in the world of organizations and nations, as a matter of fact. So, question, what is it that really is at the heart of change? And I want to suggest two things and talk about one right now. I think at the heart of really getting into this culture change thing, which I know is such a tough thing, besides innovating management, and that is something I want to talk about a little bit later. Management is way behind in its processes and its way of thinking. Management, C-level, and as it filters through the whole organization, we've got to innovate management. You have an article that I've written about that in your packet or on the site. But the thing I would like to talk with you about is the real secret, and that is changing people's mental models. The mental model of organization today, if you go out and ask people to draw the organization, I'm going to bet you, $20 or whatever, that most of your people will draw an organogram. If that's the case, you've lost the battle right from the get-go. Because what we want to have is inside people's heads, because it's inside people's heads that they are every day when we don't have our controls, we don't have our reward systems, we don't have our management oversight. Most people are working most of the time with their mental models governing what they do. And so when their boss says do something, and they're in the midst of doing something that's horizontal that relates to your value stream, what are they going to do? They're probably going to do what their boss asked them to do. And now that may not be a bad thing, but certainly if I'm working on something more important and I have a mental model of I'm part of a value stream, I'm going to go to my manager and I'm going to say, guess what? I'm working on this. Do you really want me to work on this right now? Can we push that off until a little bit later? Also, if I'm operating on a value network or a supply chain or a value stream way of thinking, and I see a problem or I anticipate a problem, then I should be willing to raise that problem even though it may cause me a little bit of stress. But in today's organizations, because of my mental model that I'm reporting up to the boss, my performance appraisal might in fact be in jeopardy if I show that there's a problem here, I'm not going to say anything. And that mental model is going to work against everything that you and I are trying to do in our transformative approach. If we say to people, we want you to continuously learn, but there's not really a mental model that learning matters, that it's going to make any difference, then I'm not going to do it. And I'm going to say, John has written about, 45% of the success of supply chain is in technology, and 45% or so is in the human side. I'm going to be willing to bet that we could get at least 50% of that 45%. If we could get inside mental models, that will unleash an energy that will be so profound that we will be able to, the sky will be the limit. So bottom line, I think we're trying to create smart organizations. We're trying to create smart houses. We're trying to create smart airplanes with the skin of the stealth bomber, for example, sensing at the same time as the pilot is sensing and so on. We're trying to create smart everything. Why not try to create a smart organization where everybody at the edges is smart, thinking, innovating, adapting, and being part of the executive team of the organization. It's like the body. The body has, an executive system in the nervous system, but the other systems are thinking and adapting all the time without the intervention of the brain. I think that's what we need to be trying to do.
And this is the power of that integrative. I mean, it is all about integrative. And we build teams. What do you build a team and then give them goals, or do you build teams around goals? It's one or the other, and I can tell you, I know which one works and which one doesn't work. Jake.
Well, good morning. I'm very pleased and proud to be here. I actually consider John to be a kindred spirit and a very early pioneer in understanding the fact that the dynamics of the business environment that we compete in has forever changed, and that our business models need every single day to be understanding the context of adapt or die. And so Pat's point around saying, wait a minute, we're at the precipice of being able to have a shift. We've been practicing at P&G for the last 15 years, quite frankly, from an infancy state of stumbling upon it because of a compelling business issue and need, but working our way through a journey of both most of what Pat talks about as well as what John has written about. And it is a journey. So it's not something that's going to happen organically just overnight, but I think I can give you a couple of clues and ahas about how you can think about sustaining that. The first panel talked today an awful lot around how to think about the design component. I would submit to you that the design is never finished. And that if you don't appreciate the fact that what you must build into the organization is this adaptability for change, and that every single day you should be monitoring and measuring whether you're actually changing. So I'll give you a small taste of that inside P&G. So I've got some colleagues in the room, quite frankly, who helped to pioneer part of this work in our early stages. But for every single new employee we bring into the company, the first thing that we teach them on the supply chain side has absolutely nothing to do with their daily work. Or rather, I should say, everything to do with their daily work. Because we teach them about change. We teach them how to actually leverage change. We teach them techniques in what we call work process improvement. We teach them techniques on problem solving. We teach them techniques on value stream understanding and mapping. We teach them an ownership concept that says they actually own it no matter what is happening across it. Whether it's inside, outside, we own it physically or not. Roddy's piece around the shelf back is a great illustration of that. That came from our chairman identifying what we call passionately the 2 moments of truth. But what it allowed to do is something that most companies today simply cannot execute. The ability to translate an important, crystallized, market-focused objective simply that can connect with everyone in the organization. Those 2 moments of truth are what we live by, what we govern by, and while we have continued to build upon them, every single one of our individuals in the organization can tie what they are working on back to one of those 2 things. It's that simple. Right? The change element. You may say, gosh, we do change, we do it. I want to give you a small microcosm of it, and we can talk it as we go through the panel. Guys, we know we're living in a very constantly changing world. Our business model is no different. We do business in 300 countries around the world. We're blessed with a brand portfolio with 25 individual brands that are a minimum of $1 billion or larger. We have another 22 that are $500 million or larger on their way toward $1 billion. But the glue of that, and what makes it happen every day, is not just our designs of our supply chains, not just our product innovation, but it's this change focus of our people. One small example. Everyone is currently familiar with what is going on in Egypt, a country trying to find its way for the first time toward a democracy. In the midst of all of that, we have a very thriving business, growing by leaps and bounds. An economy that has been spurred and is growing, a growing middle class, a growing sense of consumers that know what they want, what benefits they need, and a need for us to continually change our product portfolio. In the midst of all the chaos that was going on in Egypt, we had a product introduction that we needed to execute. Now, these are folks that are working for us that, quite frankly, needed a higher order level of comfort. Chaos is all around them. There's technically rioting in the streets. One case study. Our best ever effort to relocate an existing production line of the technology we were using for this product introduction to make the change and introduce the new product into market was 38 days. This team, in the midst of all that was falling around them, if I had the time to show you the video, did it in less than 8 hours.
Holy cow.
This is at the time when they didn't even know if they had a country that they were living in. What drove us through that was their passionate ownership, because we gave them these results objectives. They understood and were committed to the business results, and we had provided them the tools to be able to execute that change on their own. They didn't need leadership. What they needed was the freedom to actually go to the work. They understood the objective. We were able to translate it, and they had the personal conviction and the tools of how to actually adapt the change. We had the product in the market, in the stores, wildly successful at the same time the country is really coming apart. A testament, guys. This works when you're able to put the pieces together.
And you know what's interesting, having worked with P&G for 12 years as an analyst, this shelf-back thinking drove governance in the organization. So I remember I had, and at least I have a kindred spirit from the brewing industry here because I use so many brewing examples. I'd seen Anheuser-Busch's demand sensing where they could, in a 3-tier system, sense changes of demand literally within hours. And I took it to P&G and I said to P&G, wow, you talk about demand sensing on the shelf. Here's incredible technology that Anheuser-Busch built. And Jake said, we don't have the processes to do anything with that data, so we'll give it a break. And it took them a year. They figured out that there were 5 events that they needed to track: a stock out, a promotion, a launch, inventory high, inventory low. Built the process, then said, okay, now we're ready for the technology. Now, how many organizations do you see work like that? Or the governance in P&G that said, guess what? You're not working a moment of truth number 2 if you haven't got number 1 right, because the consumer may have taken a product that wasn't on the shelf because it was in stock out. They chose something else. So what do you want to know about what are you going to learn about the consumer that took the other product? Let's get 1 right, and then we will get 2 right and understand why the consumer, because the 2 moments of truth are when I say it's available, it will be available, and I understand why consumers choose and use our products. So very, very profound stuff. Thank you very much, Jake. So Bill, let's get to the Dell story.
Okay, sounds great, Roddy. Good morning, everybody. Just want to echo a couple of thoughts that my co-panelists made and then also add to that. The thought I'll throw on the table is, as an organization, either you're driving innovation and driving transformation or you're becoming less relevant. And never has that been so important as it is today. As the clock speeds of our industry continue to increase, as the level of competition, the number of new entrants all of us have to deal with steadily increase, we as executives have to learn to be able to adopt and drive transformation and fundamentally rethink the way we do business for our companies. We used the Dell example. John talked earlier. Dell had the luxury of being a 28-year-old, $60 billion company who grew in large part because we had redefined the distribution model to the customer with the direct model in the 90s. It just so happens in the middle 2000s, we realized that we had ridden that horse a little too long. The model that we had used and the markets we played in were relevant for about 1 in 4 customers globally in the hardware business. So when you've perfected and designed and you thought you had a leading edge in a supply chain that was relevant for 1 in 4 customers globally, that was a pretty interesting moment of truth. And it created a burning platform for our organization to drive change in the fundamental way that we went to market, the cost structure and the complexity we had in our business, and really come back to, number 1, what our customers valued, and number 2, an investment in innovation, not just in products, but in the way we delivered solutions to our customers and understanding how critical that was. It wasn't enough to have a great model in one way of distribution to the customer. We had to fundamentally rethink that. So Dell's been through a number of transitions and transformations over the last 5 years to support that journey and that cause. Some have been around complexity reduction and cost reduction. Some have been around the integration of new companies and new intellectual property. We've actually made 18 acquisitions in the last 3 years. Talk about transformation and how you incorporate that in to be accretive to your business for your customers. That's been a pretty interesting challenge as well. And finally, transforming the business in one that was focused on hardware to one that has a strength in hardware and a relationship with a customer and then can provide more technical services and solutions to our customer. So transformation has been fundamental to what we've done and what we continue to do in the company to be successful. As Roddy mentioned, we were actually a 3.6 on the scale, so we're not done. I don't think anyone's done, but we have a lot to learn from the companies that have done this longer in the ways of how you codify this into your management structure, how you build this into your culture, and how you avoid, I think our example earlier from Polo was the diving catches in the supply chain to be one in which those processes are institutionalized in what we do.
So what's very interesting about P&G and Dell, those of you that track the AMR Top 25, P&G is the only company that for all 8 years has been in the top 5 of the top 25, and Dell has been there for most of the time. So that graph that I put up that says leaders are looking at their practices, they're looking at their performance, and they're codifying what's best in class. And that becomes the foundation that gets people to work in their DNA in the right way. And I mean, this is, when you see companies, when you walk into a company that does this, it just smells different. Anyway, Paul.
Thank you, Roddy, and good day to everybody. It's nice to be back in Singapore. I'm actually based out of Singapore. But for those of us that tend to do regional roles, we don't end up being in the place where we live. So the region that we look after, and the story that I do want to share with you today, is a bit about our journey, which is a short one over the last 4 to 5 years. In Diageo, we obviously have a vast array of products that range from the perishable beers that we see in the likes of Guinness and RTD like Smirnoff Ice, to the extremes of Scotch, which is up to 40 years old. Obviously some different dynamics when you look at the supply chain and trying to plan out 40 years compared to something that's only going to be on shelf for a month or two. Within the region, we have enormous complexity in what we look after out of Singapore. We principally set up a hub here about 6 or 7 years ago, and we look after all of the supply chain and procurement from China right down to New Zealand, all the way over to the Middle East, including North Africa, and also then servicing all of the airports globally. So you can imagine that being able to do that requires different tools, different skills, different attributes depending on the market dynamics and the flexibility that you need within your supply chain. And what is most important for us is the agility in order to deliver on that demand requirement. When I came into the region about 4 or 5 years ago, and we had started on the journey about what we needed from a supply chain perspective in order for it to deliver against the customer demand, what was quite evident was that the normal rules that we had within Diageo in developed markets wasn't going to be fit for purpose. And therefore, a demand-driven value network was what we had to look at. In order for it to do that, there's 3 aspects that you need to fundamentally change, which are not easy elements to go after. 1, your physical asset structure has to be different in order for it to be able to react and have agility in that supply chain. 2, the processes that you historically use, whether that be sales and operating planning, customer collaboration, forecast accuracy, or your manufacturing plans, have to change as well because they have to have agility built into them. And then the 3rd aspect is your human capital. You need to have the right people, whether that be people that are change agents, whether that's people that are like-minded, individuals that understand that it's coming from a demand-driven perspective rather than historically looking at optimizing your supply chain and realizing the lean principles that we all grow up with and are educated to employ. And I think what we found was that taking the risk on doing those aspects, which was against the grain of historically how we had done things in Diageo, is a big leap forward. But ultimately, what was truly driving that was the request from a customer and a consumer perspective. We have fundamentally changed the way that we work within this region, and we're not even there yet. I don't know where we'd be if we were to mark ourselves on the scale of the 1 to 5. But what I can say is that looking at realizing the growth opportunity, especially in diverse markets that we service, is actually driving a business benefit and ultimately is driving value to the top line, driving value to the bottom line, and also reducing our cost base as well, as we have driven inventory efficiencies through that. So as part of the discussion today, I'm very happy to share some of the insights, some of the journey that we're on, some of the things that we have failed and succeeded then in rectifying, and also some of the challenges that we also face in the coming years as we continue to grow our organization here.
So Paul, what was interesting in the way you spoke about the journey was I could hear the integrative language. In other words, this is not about bloody-mindedly chasing after 5 projects on the strategic project portfolio and not knowing what the connectivity or the impact across these projects are. You know, what's profound in companies that have codified the way they work and why a project-based approach to building end-to-end simply doesn't work beyond stage 3 is that there's nobody that says, you know, maybe my S&OP process is not working because I haven't defined the right goals for the people, right? Somebody's going to go, sales and operations plan, let's just do it, finish the project, reward it for the fact the project's finished, but doesn't make a contribution to the business. How many times don't we hear from executives that say, everybody's doing a great job in the projects, why can't I see it in the business results?
I think, Roddy, one of the other big barriers that we see is the internal obstacles that we have within organizations. You know, moving from an organization where supply chain primarily put the product in a box and deliver it to a distributor to actually going out and talking to customers, because, well, that's the sales guy's job. You know, but why are you going out talking to customers? And having that conversation that you're actually driving value, not just for the organization that you're within, but also through customer collaboration with that organization, has reaped enormous benefits to now where, you know, we are the ones that are spearheading the relationship and then fueling the opportunity in order for it to drive additional sales. So I think that's one of the big benefits that we see in getting out there and being demand.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paul. So unfortunately, Eagle is not here, so we're going to jump straight to Dr. Dag Eriksson. Introduce yourself and give us some key thoughts from a academic, practical, talent development point of view in supply chain.
Thank you. Thank you, Roddy. It's nice to be here, John. I appreciate it. It's so nice to have the opportunity to networking with you guys, because I was introduced as an academic, and that's true. But that's only half true, because I spent half my life in industry all the time, 30 years by now, working with big industry and some other industries, trying to get their thoughts to implement it at the university, because as we heard before, in most cases, universities are lagging behind the rest, and we have to bridge that gap. That's my main concern right now. And I think it's so easy to say the things we're saying here, to do things right instead of doing the right things, for example. That's easy to say. And going from efficiency to effectiveness, that's easy. From push to pull. But to do it in real life, that's something completely different. And I'm working a lot with Electrolux, the big Swedish company. And the CEO of Electrolux, Stråberg, he once said it in a good way when he started a change journey with Electrolux. He said that we have to stop trying to sell what we can produce. We have to start producing what we can sell. And that's a completely 90 degrees turnaround. It sounds so simple, but we have been working on it for 8 years now. We're not there yet, but we're moving towards your maturity level number 5 anyway. And what I'm trying to do, I've written about 30 books or something on it, but I started out as a normal logistician in the silo, teaching and talking about inventory control and transportation and whatever. But if you're working in industry, you see this is not enough. It was enough in the beginning of the 60s and 70s in Sweden, because we had the huge demand. The only problem was to get it out on the market, which was the last 1,000 kilometers away. So that was the start of the Swedish concept of materials administration logistics. But then as you move on, you see that you have to put in a lot of other relationships as well, and moving into supply chain management then. But now we're moving one step further. We talked about demand-driven networks. And I'm right now writing a book called Demand Networks, which is kind of trying to use the links we have in supply chain to put up a fishnet approach, and where you have everything is dependent on the other. And I'm also moving from, we can call it the game of power to the game of trust, and that's not easy. Mm-hmm. So what I'm trying to do, and we heard from the other panel as well, that I think we have to change the universities. We have to change a lot of the things we're doing at the universities. And I can tell you that's not an easy thing to do. You talk about difficulties and silos in industry. Come to a university and look at the silos in between different departments. Even simple connections like marketing and logistics could be very difficult. And now we're talking concurrent design and concurrent engineering, trying to do the same kind of approach at the universities. That's hard work. That's why I've been on it for 40 years, I know. And I'm not still in your 5th maturity level, but we're working very hard on it. And I think I've gone through all of these stages ahead with SKF, the ball bearing company. I started with them in 1970, and we were at the first stage of your maturity model. And then we moved on, so we are or at least approaching the fifth state, I would say. But the thing we have noticed all the time is that we have to get it out in the university to prepare the guys there with the competence needed in industry. And what is needed is leadership and management, and the difference between the two as well, and change management, as Pat said before. And when I introduced that in my programs for doctor students, for master students, there were some hesitations, not from the students, they love it, but from parts of the administration, because they said, yeah, but that's not logistics, is it really? And I have to explain to them that is really logistics or supply chain, whatever you would like to call it today. So that's why it's so nice to network with you guys here, because one of the problems we have in Sweden is that some of the CEOs in Sweden, they don't go to this kind of summits if it's not in Davos and the summit and there, because they think they know it all. Not all of them, but some of them. And that's why it's a different spirit here in HS in that respect. We talked about that yesterday. So what I'm going to bring home is the conviction that we're on the right track doing what we're doing with the kind of mix at the university. And also that the move towards demand and consumer insight and so on, which we have been working on for some 10 years at least now, is also the right thing. And to put in change management in turning around and transforming supply chain, that's the real issue.
So I often have Dr. Steve Melnick from Michigan State on panels. In fact, I had him on one last week, and he made two very profound points. That's why it's good to have, it's a challenge sometimes, but it's good to have academics on a panel. He made one point, was he said, we're moving from output-driven functions to outcome-driven business plans.
Exactly.
And that's transformational. I mean, you know, not rewarding functional outputs, but rewarding business outcomes, and doing that integratively is a significant challenge.
That's the only way to do it.
Yeah.
And
the second,
thing, I can say another thing, and that is we talk about innovation from time to time. And a lot of supply chain managers, not you of course, but some others, they think that this Kaizen approach, improving a little bit what you have already been doing, but doing it a little better, that's not innovation.
Well,
that's not real innovation.
And that's a good point. The other point he makes is he says, we're not refining the supply chain, we're redefining the supply chain. And I think that's the transformation. So this is a good point to tee Pat up, because you know, in all my experience and watching what Pat has done, and we brought her into AMR and I worked with her at South African breweries, what's really interesting is what Pat has done is she's codified this changing the mental models into, can we do this through streams of goals that we're tracking in the organization? So Pat, how do we change mental models to transform an organization? What's the secret sauce?
Ooh, first of all, I think we need to stop our dependency on structure, on hard structure, because hard structure isn't agile enough. And I would envision that in 50 years' time, the fully flexible organization is going to just be a sea of processes that are crossing each other that are outcome focused. So I'm very fascinated by the role of goal processes. And I think that there are three fundamental streams of goals that are operating in an organization at any point in time. One is the stream of goals that sort of flows functionally. We've got the organization set up, we have our functional requirements. It's a little relatively stable, but we want continuous improvement. Another is that we have a stream of goals that cuts across, and you know, in the larger scheme of things, goes from the customer all the way back to the very early suppliers in an operational kind of more standard flow mode. And then on top of that, I think we have a set of goals that are fully transformational. They appear just like a quark, I guess. They appear as long as they're needed, and then they go away. So we need to have goal management processes that connect all of those. And I think that now underneath that, thinking in terms of transformation, the way we design these goal flows can actually help us create that fully smart organization. Because the goal flow, when we set it up, I think a fundamental requirement is that the flow should be a visual stream that connects all the players. So you never have a player who feels in isolation. So I think we can do a lot with the visual flows of goals. A second thing is we need to find ways to connect the executive system with the operating system for the goals. And that if we do it right, then we can encourage our executives and our leadership, our C-suite people and the next level down, to see their role not as micromanaging, not as jumping in when there are problems, not as coming in and fixing everything and causing panic in the system, but rather as being the designers that are continually balancing resources, continually making it easier within the formal structures to get things done. That I think we need to start doing more to support executives and leaders as designers of the organization in a fluid kind of agile way. So to me, the goal management processes are possibly the key to creating a flexible and yet aligned and dynamically connected organization. And in order, for that to happen, we need to re-educate everybody around their role, because it's like in the body. Every part of the body is fully accountable for performing its own function, but within the larger system. Because if the heart optimizes itself at the expense of everything else in the system, then you die. So I think, our goal management processes are very underutilized. And one more point about that, the one thing we know from psychological, industrial psychology research, possibly one of the few things that's been proven over time, is that one of the most reliable things that we can do to ensure aligned performance is be sure that people have a clear sense of what they're trying to do, even though that might change over time. So having that sense of goals that I've helped created, that I participate in, I see how everything fits, that I think is going to be a key.
Great.
And there are ways to do it.
Thank you very much, Pat. So what I'm going to do is I'd like to start thinking about a question. I'm going to ask Jake to touch on what Pat has just spoken about, because if anybody has gone down this journey and has codified it, it's been the P&G sort of way of doing things. And then we'll take a question from the audience.
Yeah, I think Pat offers a really solid foundation for how to approach it. We've kind of backed our way into part of that. So as Roddy was talking across the journey we've been on, we had these functional silo goals that really weren't connected to the end-sum game at all. I mean, you can say they were indirectly or somewhat directly, but I'll give an example. We changed and literally threw the paradigm upside down when we said those two moments of truth. And the first moment of truth is is it available when the consumer wants to make that choice? That very sacred choice, whether it's in a kiosk in Bangladesh or a hypermarket. So to the first panel in the example that Ralph Lauren was providing around, you have to win across everywhere you must touch a consumer. But when you think about the second moment of truth of the quality element, which brings them back after that first purchase. Our quality folks thought that all they owned was to the point of production. They felt no accountability beyond the production to the distribution point, the first point of sale, to the in-store usage experience or the kiosk. You talk about game changing. When we made them accountable in their metrics and their reward system to actually all the way, even though they don't own all the way, well, factory managers, I'm worried about my costs, I'm worried about my throughput. When you made them accountable not only for service at the point of purchase and cash for the value stream. Whoa, game changing. When you made them accountable for the delivery of the innovation to market, broke down an awful lot of barriers very quickly between the design team. So we had the first panel talking about, wait a minute, I got the design, I chucked it over, and then I had this compromise, right? We do I call it three-dimensional concurrent design that Charlie Fine speaks about from an MIT standpoint around product, process, and supply chain all together. Now that, again, has been an acquired skill that we've been after for the last 15 years, and we're much better at it now than we were, but even on Roddy's model, we view ourselves well short. Right? Now, if you don't think when you put those together and you connect the measures that they don't work, I'll give you a small microcosm to look at. We have delivered more cost savings and cash improvement to the company in the last 2 years than we did in our previous 10. You get that? In the last 2 years versus the previous 10. So anyone that tells you that when you get to a maturity state that you've already mined the field and there's no crap, it's crap, send them packing. They don't know what they're talking about, because the next piece of looking, as Pat was describing, across and empowering people to actually go turn the rocks and rethink the design equation. It rains money. It literally rains money.
Paul's got a comment.
Yeah, just to build on a similar experience that we have within Diageo, is we changed our operating model about 1.5 years ago, which principally was to bring the accountability and autonomy down to a market level. So if I take, for instance, of what we do in Australia, where we have an intact business, where we do primarily 90% of the production for the local market. Our operators are actually measured and also rewarded from a bonus perspective on the overall sales and cash delivery of the business. The level of focus that is bringing to be delivering on new innovations, still very focused on ensuring that the cost drivers are there and that we're lean in our process, but our service figures have come up exceptionally, and our customer collaboration, in order for it to get an understanding of what the customer requires in order for it to drive that additional growth, has brought leaps and bounds to the total organization. So I think there's definitely opportunity there from how we reward and recognize people, because at the end of the day, we can have aspirational goals from a total business perspective, but bringing it back to the reality of what can I influence, and therefore how can I be recognized and rewarded for that, brings it real to the individual.
So an illustrative point, and I remember, over the 12 years I worked with P&G, I could literally, if I replay my memories of the organization progressing through these stages, we often forget about the implications for manufacturing. So in stage 2, a goal in manufacturing is schedule adherence. Pretty classic manufacturing stuff. But when you get to stage 4 and you're sensing on the shelf, what about same-day schedule execution? Right? Because I now sense a stock out in hours, I can't have manufacturing say, well, we'll figure it out, don't worry. I mean, we're in a stock out situation, and my first moment of truth says the product's going to be there. So fundamentally changes.
Now, Roddy, if I could just throw one comment on top of that, because it ties back to the first panel again. To all my engineering friends in the audience who understand theory of constraints and understand mechanical processes and transformation processes. The age-old theory that we were all raised in, most of us, is the best optimum way to get the perfect execution out of a piece of machine, a designed piece of perfectly performing machine, is to turn it on and run it and never turn it off. Right? We have completely flipped that upside down. I get higher rates of capacity utilization than at any time in the company's history, and we are changing over 100 times more than what we did 5 years ago. You get that? Higher rates of capacity utilization than ever before, but changing over 100 times more than in the past. So when people again tell you, no, you cannot do that, yes, you can, but it requires, again, going through and doing this piece with the operation. And most of those changes, guys, came for free. It was not a massive capital expansion program that we had to. Most of those insights came from the organization by holding them accountable for saying, here's the output that the value stream needs to be able to deliver on reaction time to market. Here's the pinch point of how operating in a cash positive situation for the brand and the business that we need to deliver. Now go tell us what needs to be true to be able to allow that to happen. It brought the design and the engineering people, it brought the manufacturing, brought all the rest of the supply chain functions, it brought the material people from procurement together. And amazingly, guess what? Low capital solutions where we're able to cycle through things. So days between next run, which is fundamental. How long does it take us to get from the very first SKU in the lineup all the way through and back? On most of our businesses today, what used to be measured in weeks is now measured in days or hours.
Good. So, Bill, I'm going to take an audience question. Then I would like for you to translate what it meant going to a shelf from the traditional model and some of the challenges that you've heard the other panel, and then we're going to go to Dr. Dagg and talk about some of those perspectives. So do we have any audience questions? If we have one question, if you can just stand up, they'll bring you a microphone.
We face a serious challenge. It's complex, and we actually program for avoidance of accountability in the way in which we design our businesses. Increasingly with national defense, we have a continuous supply chain right into the private sector. When I listen to this, and I think of in-service support and the cultural divide from a rule structure point of view between a public service agency and a private sector business as it relates to end-to-end supply chain, I have to ask the question, how do you even begin to bridge that divide?
Well, I mean, I'll take a crack. So we can't speak, we're not in the defense industry, right? But the way that we try to look at it is we've redefined ownership. So ownership is not about who owns the physical asset. Ownership is about what is the outcome that the value stream has to deliver to, right? So in our case, it's a consumer experience or whatever. But we're doing things we never have done before. So we bring in suppliers, material suppliers, platform and process suppliers, and we actually have them involved in the design team up front of what we're trying to deliver on the outside. That, for many in the audience, I think you understand, that's like heresy, man. It's like you're giving away the keys to the kingdom because, oh my God, then everybody's going to know what we're going to do, and then, right? It's one of those things, and I think Pat spoke to it. You have to redefine your boundary of how you look at the organization. So I think I think your example is a great one, but the boundary that you're describing is still structurally there, right?
In fact, it makes me think of your value stream mapping to launch a new product, where everybody sits end to end, and we look for win-win solutions. And I think Jake's right. I think the problem is, let's not presuppose where those structural boundaries are, and maybe that's what we've got to start challenging.
Yeah, and I think related to that point, Roddy, I think one of the points I was going to add to what the panelists talked about in the way of transformation is there's a number of impediments. I mean, transformation, everybody gets it, everybody thinks it's important. What are the impediments? Why aren't people more successful in driving transformation? And I think what we found was without the right executive support and a top-down mandate to drive change end-to-end in the supply chain, it's really difficult to do it at a functional level. I've been in companies where we've tried to do it at a functional level and we've gotten, I would say, suboptimal results, maybe a very effective logistics or fulfillment design or manufacturing process, but we've really not fundamentally changed or transformed the business the way we have at Dell because we got the mandate across the executive team and the alignment across the executive team, also the alignment in the way we compensate and the way we measure success that really helped to propel the organization forward. The last piece I would add is aggressive talent management is critical to transformation.
Yeah.
And I would look at that a couple of ways. Number one, are we hiring problem-solving skills, folks who are open-minded and who have the intellectual curiosity to be progressive in the design of solutions for the company? Number two, have we been able to identify the weeds in the organization who aren't going to change and who always have a million reasons for why we should keep doing things the way we have, managing those folks out of the organization or helping to try to change their mindset is critical to your success, because that cancer spreads through the organization and prevents you from being as good as you can be in your transformation and really accomplishing what you need to do.
Those of you who were at John Gatorna's last event in Sydney, Dina Olofsson at the end summed up and made 3 very profound points. She said, I don't know, sort of Pat saying, I don't know about supply chain, but when I listened to the debate, number one, are the CEOs working at breaking down functional silos? Are we still rewarding functional performance? And is there anybody who understands the end-to-end business well enough? I mean, those are kind of real fundamental questions, and I think this is what you're hearing the panel talk about. Dag.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I wanted to comment on this vertical versus horizontal way, not academic mumbo jumbo, but what we have been doing in SKF. And we started, of course, by defining the customer. And of course, you find right away that there's a difference between OEM, spare parts, and also distributors. And then you start to think about what should we do then to really give the benefits to the customer. When we started to talk about spare parts, and then you have to distinguish between spare parts for scheduled maintenance and breakdown spare parts. That's one. So you get the segmented model. Everybody talks about segmented supply chains today. We call it channels at that time. So we built channels from this point of view, from the customer. I mean, Fisher talks about the product as a kind of good thing to start with. It's part of it. But, this is 6501, which is the ball bearing. It's bought for several different purposes. And it's different between 6501 bought for maintenance, scheduled maintenance, and 6501 bought for breakdowns. So we have to have completely different channels. And how do we do that in practice? We started by defining what the customer wants and then build backwards all the way through. But this means that you're going to hit a lot of boundaries in between. The first one you hit, of course, is the factory manager. And he has his KPIs, his way of looking at profitability and everything. And then you move further up to the suppliers. And then we designed the channel, fine, and we took some students from my university, and they were channel captains coming in to do this horizontal flow. And the first thing they met was really resistance. The guy who had been factory manager for 25 years, he said, "Son, how long have you been here?" "Well, a couple of months now." "Well, I've been here 25 years. I tell you how to do this, and this is the way to do it." "No, but we're trying a different approach." "We've tried that before, it doesn't work." "It won't work now either." So what we had to do is to put in a lot of work to change the KPIs and to put in some activity-based costing. It took us 4 years, matter of fact. So we were possible to measure along the horizontal way and along the vertical way to show guys this is what's happening. But then that wasn't enough, because then the factory manager say, "Yeah, I can do it for you, but it's going to cost me $70,000 because I have to break my runs." So we gave him $70,000, not in cash, but he was credited for $70,000. He should have made more if he had been going on his own schedule. So that's part of what you really have to do. It's a very big difference. I mean, this is the kind of things I try to teach my students. It's a different thing sitting down, looking at accounting on whatever KPIs. You have to change it and to do it. But the most important thing was not the change of techniques and technology, the change of mindset.
Right.
That's why it
And
took
that's
so
Pat's
long.
point.
That's exactly why it took so long.
Yeah,
but
right.
that's important.
Yeah, Roddy,
Thank you, Nick.
Roddy, I call this where, and I love Pat's analogy before, I call it we're at the precipice of having a giant going out of business sale. I mean, we are. If we don't come to the recognition that we are at a change point, I guarantee if we went around and polled the entire audience, there's not a single company in here who has a need to get to market slower than they did last month, who can afford to spend more cash than they did a week before, who can afford a higher cost structure, who, by the way, has a consumer who's less demanding and wants less features, not more features or benefits. By the way, for a lower cost than they paid on the previous version, right? who has a problem today in the capability of the organization to deliver that rate of agility and change from a skill standpoint, right? So no matter what industry we're from, we all have the same common platform, right? And so the challenge I believe we have is we either can say we're going to allow it to happen to us, or to Roddy's point on the model, we're going to step back and say what are those 2 or 3 things that need to be true about how the executives are messaging into the operation, to Pat's point. What are the 2 or 3 things we must change about the talent procurement process? By the way, a general comment, the talent shortfall is global. I sit on a cross-industry, 13-industry vertical, benchmark leaders for the world. All of them are bitching about the fact that there is a shortage of talent. But what I think we're articulating is the fact that the talent is also looking for something different than what we've provided them before, right?
Okay.
And then we get into the metrics piece. If you're going to put handcuffs on them on day one, because the only decision can be made by the 25-year factory manager, then guess what? Hang the shingle, game over, we're done, right? So the challenge for us is to say, how do we institute bringing people in and showing them the ability, as Roddy is trying to get you to warm up to recognize that change is constant. Change is good. Change will keep us ahead. And if I can leverage that and the right clear, succinct message from the top around the 1 or 2 most important things that we need to do, then I can get the whole organization galvanized. Our journey so far, to me, is nothing more than tripping and failing and learning and figuring many of these things out. But we're still learning, because we're still tripping and falling and failing. But what we're getting is we're getting the entire 120,000 person organization galvanized day after day after day, closer and closer to that quick drumbeat, heartbeat where everybody is clean and clear, and those functional boundaries came and are coming down.
Pat.
There's another set of boundaries I think that are coming down related to talent. I think we're used to seeing talent as people are the unit, but I think the real unit of talent are the skills within the people.
Yeah.
So a person might be deployed, I'll just use the goal streams again, on multiple goal streams.
Yeah.
And that's, we've got to, it's very difficult when we sit with designs of organizations where the boss owns the person, because the person is a packet of capability that we need to learn how to deploy ultimately in a lot of different streams in the business. And that's going to challenge how we actually manage and structure the whole human resource system. But that's a whole other topic.
So just to pick up, because I think that we're still on track with picking up on your question, and that is, this goes to the IT alignment with supply chain as well. So IT's out there modeling with all sorts of fancy IT-based tools. The business is doing flow streaming and lean analysis. But where's the value stream analysis that brings the two groups together? So, I mean, the story I love to tell is a well-known pharmaceutical company in public said the head of process excellence went into a blueprinting project and said, "Why are you modeling that way?" And they said, "Well, that's the way the system works. That's the way we have to operate." So that's not the way we operate this business. And are you aware that that simple transaction takes 9 departments to be successful? Well, where's that in the model? So what we've got is this massive discrepancy. That there are structural boundaries, and there are also different systems that are driving different behaviors. And we've got to bring the structural boundaries down and start doing things like value stream mapping so that we actually see where the value is and start looking at the goals, looking at the metrics, looking at the outcomes. And that's a fundamental requirement. And we can do that, but we just don't. Any other questions from the audience for now? One question. Yes.
On with the Coca-Cola Company. And this question is primarily for Paul, but everybody else can answer too. I'm constantly intrigued by the differences in companies in the value chains. Like a pharmaceutical company has a very long pipeline with an uncertain likelihood of success along the way. The spirits industry, on the other hand, you're producing a product now that you're going to sell 40 years from today. So the question for Paul is aligning organizational structure and reward systems when you have the unique situation where you're dealing with a short-lived product like Guinness and a long-lived product like 40-year-old spirits. How do you align those kind of reward systems to meet those different dynamics?
Well, I'll go back to the point that I talked about in how you structure yourself from a physical perspective and from a process perspective, and then also the human capital, the people piece. One of the things that we identified in this region, and this region is our most complex region globally, we had to change the way that we worked and how we worked and what we did to make things in order for it to fuel and support the growth agendas that we have. Because you've got markets like Vietnam where you've got double digit, you've got places like Australia where you're down in the low single digits. And they all require a unique service provision compared to what you do in a more established market like the US or in Europe. We changed our model from a physical perspective to talk about postponement. And postponement for us, if I take what we do with Scotch, and Scotch we have various ages from product that's 2 years old right up to the 40-year-olds, that is one, a different channel than where it's going, and then two, a different growth pattern depending on where the opportunity lies. We produce our primary pack still in Scotland because it's Scotch, it has to come from Scotland. We then bring that primary pack, and to use the model here in Singapore, we have a postponement center here in Singapore where we add the secondary packaging, the tertiary packaging, and then the customer-specific packaging depending on what market it needs to go to or what customer it needs to land. In addition to that, what we also created over the last few years is what we call our super deluxe capability here within Singapore, so that there are unique high-worth individuals that are looking for something different and special. We just recently had a baccarat of Scotch for the Jubilee with the Queen, and they retail at £100,000. That's a very different model and a very different customer than somebody who is adoring our product like Johnny Walker Red. Yeah. The other piece that we've added in the last 2 years, and it is about agility and speed to market, is we've also built what we're calling design houses. So we have implemented a Johnny Walker house in Shanghai, which gives additional opportunity to have a different clientele that look at something that's even more unique that you can't get anywhere else. We know that the likes of India and China have massive opportunity for us. You know, the population that's there. I was just reading yesterday where there was an insight into the amount of billionaires. There's over nearly 300 billionaires in China at the moment. And that's what's on record. Who knows what else there is out there. So that's the physical process. We then build back from the demand that we see from a sales and operating planning to drive what we see going out over the next number of years. We just announced last week we're investing £1 billion in Scotland to fuel the growth that we're seeing of Scotch over the next number of years. That's a massive risk. Who knows what will be like in 20, 30 years' time. But you know what? When we look back over the last 20 to 30 years, you do see that constantly building. So there's very detailed statistical models that we use to predict what we need to have in the future, and then bringing that back to the reality of what you're living with in today. The other aspect that plays into it is having a total joined up business in what demand you actually have. So it would be nice to have 200-300% growth in 40-year-old whiskey. The reality is the demand isn't out there yet, and there is only a proportion of demand that we can service. So we have to be conscious about when we come with that product that we do have capability to fuel the growth, but in addition to that, we're also realizing the gross margin opportunity that there is. That's something that is quite unique. The last piece about the jigsaw is obviously the people that you have within that network and ensuring that everybody is lined up to the common goal. Because if you have somebody going in and sporadically driving growth, depending on the time of month or the customer that they need, that isn't helpful. But being at the front end with our sales colleagues, with our marketing colleagues in what we're driving, the innovation that we're looking at, the opportunities that we can realize, and it's back to your point about the suppliers, we're integrating our suppliers into our supply chain to come up with solutions, because you know what? They can come up with as good as solutions and faster than we can come up with the ideas. And that's what's driving the business benefit for us, and that's what will be the sustainability for the future as well.
So, Paul, what I hear is outside-in thinking. We're building supply chains around characteristic demand streams. And therefore, we can design in the kind of unique aspects of whether this is a 120,000, whether this is 40-year, and we can decide where we're going to hold it in order to postpone it. That's outside-in thinking. You hear that in Procter & Gamble, and you hear that in Dell. So what I'm going to ask the audience, at least the panel members, to do, because I think we only have 5 minutes left, and if at the end of that process there's time for one more question, we'll do that. What I ask the panel members to do is one key takeaway thought, some key nugget for you to think about as you leave this session and obviously associate with each of the individuals. And I'm going to start off with you, Pat, because I think, you know, this whole goal streams idea has been for me a huge aha. You know, building teams around product, around goals, or building goals around teams, which way around? So what would your key takeaway thought be for the audience?
I think whatever we do, our goal should be to create a smart organization, where it's smart at the edges, it's smart at the top, it's smart in the middle, it's smart throughout the whole supply chain. And I think if that's our goal, then how do we keep people aligned in a dynamic way so that that smartness can be directed at the important things of the business? And I don't think that the traditional ways of doing it are adequate. Performance management, performance appraisal, fixed structures, they don't work. I think we have to move to more process flows and mindset adjustments in order to have the results that we want.
That's a great point. And I mean, you know, the other thought that you triggered in me, and I've experienced this frustration throughout my career, when you're asked to do the portfolio of your core skills of the business, they're treating me as a person, not as a portfolio of skills. And I think when we can learn to tap into the portfolio of skills and deploy them outside of structures and outside of people, I think we start to get a fundamentally different way
And let me
of
just
working.
make one more point about that. In the traditional organization, you set your goals, and then they get broken up right away into how you've got your structure organized. So they go down through your performance system, and those goals, which should have some coherence, get broken up into manufacturing, engineering, whatever it is, and you lose track of it totally. So we need to put the goals first and say, these are the pieces of those goals, what are the skills that we need, who has those skills, we'll put those skills onto this piece, onto this piece, onto this piece. And again, people are going to be working on multiple goal flows. They do anyway. I ask people frequently, you know, what is it that, tell me who manages you? Well, you know, my boss. And I say, well, how much of the work that you do reports to your boss? It's been getting to be less and less and less of a percentage. And more of a percentage is on other things. So, you know, we need to realign our management systems for that reality.
Great point. Jake?
I think if you look across, a common characteristic of the people that are being able to weather the storm in very uncertain times and still grow their businesses are that they have embraced the construct of not only do I need to change how I'm thinking about going to market, but I have to change the design of how I have the organization set up to go win. So many companies that we end up benchmarking and talking to will talk what they want to go do, but then will act or show how they intend and plan to attack the problem using the same mechanisms that they've used for the last 30 years. They'll whip out their same silo-based organization design structure. They have their same development process for the people that are going to need to go lead this change. They don't move people across the organization. The use of the term supply chain leader is in, honestly, name only, because they don't build supply chain leaders. They either have a purchasing leader or a manufacturing leader, but they really don't have anyone who has been brought up and matured and able to rise to the challenge of leading your value stream. So it's step back and think about it. Am I attempting, is insanity in play here? I'm expecting different results using the same techniques.
And I think, to touch on the point, and I think what John Gutorna has given us in these segmentation models, being outside in demand driven, if you really understand those segments and you can do what Pat has said and what you talk about value stream, you actually are going to take massive complexity out of the end-to-end business. Bill?
Yeah, just a couple observations. One, I would say, as we gathered for this panel at breakfast this morning, the one encouraging thing was that there weren't very many degrees of separation from the spirits and beverages industry. We either had folks who worked in the spirits and brewing industry or folks who were consumers of the process, so we had a lot of common ground. But in all seriousness, the resource base that's required for a lot of these transformations, we have folks who play in functional or have functional orientation in an organization, but we don't live in a world anymore where that's enough. Those are the table stakes, and one of the things that's been critical to Dell's success is really dedicating resources to the value streams or the elements of transformation, and then have participants from the functional areas who also have a shared responsibility in that success. If you don't dedicate resources to transformation like this, it never happens. It's very difficult to get folks to do their current job and then also pick up a second job to drive something like this. So I think that value stream alignment that Pat talked about is critical, and it's one that we've seen come to fruition. Finally, when you put that structure in place and you get folks to have that value stream or end-to-end thinking, those leaders that don't have that orientation and want to stay in their functional silos really start to stick out. And then you can start to do some of that talent management we talked about earlier.
So what's interesting when you take goals, value stream, and skills, and now you superimpose on top of that we've spent $1.5 billion on whatever three-letter acronym IT system. Now you understand why there's a generation of IT that actually models the way the business works and provides information as we are going down the Kinaxis, the spheres of the world, the E2Opens of the world. They actually model the way the business works, so we're not stuck with these great big transactional boxes that do a great job of data management, but they don't actually help us go down the journey. We have to keep re-implementing every stage that we go through.
Yep.
Paul?
It's building on Bill's point, it's about the value proposition. I think the insight that I've got over the last number of years and the experience that we've had in the region is that if you can align people around the goal of the value proposition rather than their basis of their functional expertise and functional measures, there's far more value to be got for the business in its entirety from growing the brand, innovating, bringing something new to market than there is in driving cost out of the supply chain. And I think that has been the fundamental shift for us. The benefit is that in being that customer focused, it has actually driven value back through the supply chain anyway. So therefore aligning up and that communication piece, ensuring that everybody is assured that the goal is common and that's what we're going for, will actually, as you said, will rain money underneath as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's interesting is you take the pharmaceutical industry, and we've had some pretty sad recalls, chasing after incredible value propositions, but driving down and chasing costs instead of improving productivity of the business, we got ourselves into a real mess. And I think that's because the supply chain is not focused on growing and building capabilities. Instead, the only way we can retain margins is by cutting costs, and we've got to figure that out. It's just not going to work anymore. Dag?
Exactly, yeah, I agree with the rest of the panel, but I would like to stress a couple of points. It's very important that we change the mind how we look at the value chain, as you said. And that's why I said we have to start to do that at the universities to provide some of the talent for the smart organization we're talking about. But I think another thing we have to do is to really integrate the ICT people more to get an understanding from the supply chain people with the ICT people to really get this going. And that's what we're working on. And if you're going to the panel number 9, you can see one of the things Niklas Hedin and myself are working on. This brochure, Niklas is going to talk about that, because we have succeeded in several companies to really get the value chain working in practice by using ICT in the proper way, but also using people in the proper way. Because the old American saying, high tech, high touch, is really, really true. And you can't rely on technology or ICT, but if you combine that in a clever way, then you can reach these smart organizations. That's what I think we
Good.
have to
Well,
do.
I think we're at the end of time. Is that right? I would like to put a very serious hand of appreciation together for the panels. This has been a great discussion. These are very experienced people. Thank you very much. And I'm sure you're all going to get hounded with questions outside. So back to the Master of Ceremonies. Thank you.